Hello, friends, and welcome. Before we begin, let me ask you something. Where are you listening from? And what time is it right now in your corner of the world? I always find it fascinating to imagine how a story like this travels across time zones, reaching someone perhaps in the quiet of midnight, while another listener might be drifting into an afternoon nap, and yet the same voice and the same tale stretches like a thread connecting you to a moment far from your own. A moment from more than a century ago, when the world was engulfed in the chaos and uncertainty of the First World War, and the role of a commander was both a burden and a strangely isolating privilege. To imagine what it was like, let us walk through the mud of northern France, where the front lines ran like a scar across the land. The trenches, with their wooden boards and sandbag walls, were not just places to fight from but places to live, to eat, to fear, and to wait, and a commander was expected to make sense of it all. Not only to give orders but to interpret the confusion of reports, the fragments of intelligence, the rumors passed down from exhausted soldiers, and to shape them into a decision that could mean life or death for dozens of men who looked to him with eyes that carried both trust and desperation. The mornings often began before the sun rose, with the sound of boots splashing in the half-frozen puddles, and with the smell of damp wool uniforms that never quite dried, and the commander, unlike the men he led, had to think not of his own discomfort but of how to arrange a rotation, how to keep the trenches manned, how to request more rations when the bread had grown stale and the tins of bully beef seemed endless. There was a strange rhythm to it all, the messenger arriving with a note written hastily in pencil, sometimes smeared by rain, the constant scribbling in small notebooks where he tracked ammunition counts and casualties, the rare and brief moment to light a pipe or sip at lukewarm tea, always interrupted by the distant thud of artillery. You might think that being a commander gave one distance from the mud and blood, but the truth was the opposite. Every decision brought him deeper into the suffering of the men, because when one soldier fell ill with trench fever or when another broke down under the endless shelling, it was the commander who carried that weight in silence, and silence was often the only companion he had. And yet, despite the constant shadow of death, there were details of ordinary life that crept in, small things that clung to memory. The way men tied rags around their boots to muffle the squelch of mud, the way letters from home were passed along like treasures, read aloud by candlelight so that even the illiterate could hear their family's words, the way the smell of stew from a field kitchen, carried on the wind, seemed for a moment to erase the stench of decay. Commanders were not spared these sensations, nor were they blind to the laughter that sometimes broke out over the most ridiculous things, like a soldier wearing a dented pot as a helmet or the sudden appearance of a stray dog that decided to live in the trench and became a mascot, bark and all, even during bombardments. But perhaps the greatest challenge of being a commander was not the mud, not the lack of sleep, not even the responsibility for lives. It was the unending uncertainty. Orders from higher command often arrived late, or made little sense when applied to the reality of a flooded trench or a shattered dugout. And so a commander had to translate vague instructions into something workable, improvising without admitting it, so that the men believed he knew exactly what he was doing. Behind every calm word of reassurance was a storm of doubt. Yet doubt had no place on his face, and so he learned to wear a mask, not of arrogance but of quiet steadiness, because that was what kept men from breaking. And as the day wore on, the commander would walk the length of the trench, nodding to the sentries, stepping carefully to avoid collapsing duckboards, exchanging a word here and there. Not long speeches, but small reminders that he was present, that he shared the same mud and the same danger, though in truth he carried the heavier burden of command. He would pause sometimes at the observation post, peering through a narrow slit at a barren landscape of blasted trees and tangled wire, where nothing seemed to move, and yet he knew that hundreds of men, just like his own, crouched in trenches on the other side, waiting for the same orders, living the same strange half-life between boredom and terror. In the evenings, when the sky dimmed and the flicker of lanterns appeared in dugouts, there might be a moment to sit at a small desk made of rough planks, to write in his journal, or to draft the report that would be sent back by runner to the battalion headquarters. The candle flame would gutter in the draft, and his handwriting would wobble with fatigue, but he would force the words out, sometimes embellishing the truth, sometimes omitting details too grim for the paper, always aware that behind the statistics and phrases lay the faces of men he had spoken to that very morning. Outside, the guns might rumble again, and the ground might shake, but he learned to keep his pen moving steadily, because that steadiness, however small, was part of his duty too. And when the night grew late, and the men lay in their dugouts trying to sleep despite the rats scurrying across their packs and the constant dripping of water, the commander remained awake longer, listening for sounds of trouble, for whispers of a raid, for the sharp crack of rifle fire in the distance, knowing that his rest could wait but his vigilance could not. It was in those long, sleepless hours that he sometimes thought of home, not in vivid pictures, but in fragments. A memory of a warm kitchen, the smell of bread baking, the sound of a familiar voice, all so far removed from the damp darkness around him that they felt like pieces of another life, a life paused and waiting somewhere beyond the horizon of this war. This was the beginning of a commander's day, and yet it was also the beginning of an endless cycle, a cycle of mud and orders and silent endurance. And if you were to step into his boots, even for a single day, you would feel the immense weight of a role that was not simply about giving commands, but about carrying the fragile thread of hope that kept men moving forward when everything else urged them to give in. As dawn crept over the horizon, a pale light stretching across the mist that hung low over the fields, the commander stirred before the others, not because he was less weary, but because habit and responsibility pressed him awake before rest had done its work. The sound of distant artillery rolled like thunder, not close enough to shake the ground beneath the trench boards, but near enough to remind everyone that no corner of the front was ever truly quiet. He stepped out into the chill air, his boots sinking into mud that seemed determined to swallow every step, and he found himself noting how the frost clung to the sandbags, glittering faintly as if mocking the grimness of their purpose. The morning ritual was always the same in theory, but never in feeling. A quick survey of the line, a glance at the sentries, a murmured word to the sergeant who had stayed awake through the darkest hours, and then the slow shuffle toward the dugout where the runner usually waited with orders from headquarters. This time, however, the runner was late, and the commander could feel the tension of uncertainty spreading through the men, for they were quick to sense such things, and so he decided to walk among them longer than usual, stopping to lean on the parapet beside a young soldier who had joined them only a week before. The boy's eyes, wide with fatigue, followed the commander nervously, and so he asked a simple question, about the weather, about how cold the night had been, and the boy, startled at first, answered with a shy smile, as though the mere act of being noticed lifted some invisible weight. When at last the runner appeared, breathless and covered in mud from the journey, he carried not just one folded note but a small packet, which, when opened, revealed an unexpected gift. A tin of jam sent up from the rear, meant as a rare treat for the men. The commander understood immediately the power of such a small thing, and instead of keeping it for the officer's dugout, he ordered it to be shared among the platoons, a spoonful each, spread thinly on the hard biscuits that otherwise broke teeth more easily than they satisfied hunger. The laughter that followed, the jokes about how the jam must have been stolen from a general's breakfast table, were like a ripple of warmth across the cold trench, and though the commander did not laugh himself, he allowed the moment to linger, knowing how precious such moments were. By midday, the orders had been studied. A new stretch of wire was to be laid out under cover of darkness, extending the defenses toward a shallow crater that had been created by a recent bombardment. The task was dangerous, for it required men to crawl into the open, within sight of enemy sharpshooters, and so the commander spent the afternoon selecting volunteers carefully, balancing the need for experienced hands with the need to spare those already worn thin by constant duty. He spoke quietly with his sergeants, planning the timing, arranging signals, checking that the tools and rolls of wire were prepared, and all the while he kept his tone calm, steady, as though the work were no more difficult than stacking sandbags. The hours between noon and dusk were often the hardest, for the sun revealed too much. The desolation beyond the trench, the shattered trees standing like ghosts, the bodies that sometimes still lay in no man's land, unreachable, reminders of failed attacks and lost friends. The commander forced himself to look without flinching, because he believed that to turn away was a kind of betrayal, though in his private thoughts he admitted that the sight carved itself deeper into him each day, leaving marks invisible to others but sharp within his own mind. In the late afternoon, a brief distraction came in the form of mail delivery, and the men crowded eagerly around as envelopes were handed out, some written in elegant script, others scrawled hurriedly, all treasured equally. One man received a photograph of his infant daughter, and he showed it proudly to anyone who would look, passing it even to the commander, who studied it silently, then nodded with a faint smile, unable to find words but unwilling to diminish the moment with silence. Another soldier, less fortunate, received nothing, and the commander noticed the shadow that crossed his face. Later, he would quietly write a note of his own to the man's family, reminding them of their son's steadfastness, not because it was required, but because he understood how even the smallest connection to home could anchor a man through the storm. As evening descended, the preparations for the night's work grew tense. Tools were checked again, ropes coiled, rifles cleaned though they might not be fired, and the commander walked among the men, offering not grand speeches but simple phrases. "Steady now, keep close, we'll be back before dawn." His voice was level, almost mundane, yet the men listened intently, because it was not the words but the certainty beneath them that mattered. When darkness finally fell, they climbed out of the trench, moving like shadows across the broken earth, and the commander followed close behind, for he refused to send men where he would not go himself. The night was cold and sharp, every sound amplified. The clink of wire against metal, the crunch of boots on frozen soil, the low hiss of whispered orders. Flares occasionally shot into the sky from the enemy line, bathing the landscape in eerie white light, and in those frozen moments, everyone dropped flat against the ground, hearts pounding, breaths held, waiting for the darkness to return. The commander pressed himself into the mud beside his men, feeling the same fear, tasting it on his tongue, but never allowing it to rise into his voice. Slowly, steadily, the work was done, the wire unrolled and secured. The defenses extended a few yards farther, and though one man cut his hand badly on the barbs, they managed to bring him back safely, a strip of cloth bound tightly around the wound. When they finally returned to the trench, exhausted but alive, the men dropped onto the duckboards with relief, and the commander, though his body ached, forced himself to make one last round, checking each position, speaking softly to each man, ensuring no one had been left behind. Only when the final lantern was extinguished did he retreat to his dugout, where he sat at his desk once more, writing in his journal by the faint glow of a candle, recording not just the orders fulfilled but the faces, the laughter, the fear, and the fleeting moments of humanity that had carried them through the night. The following morning arrived with a chill wind that carried with it the smell of damp earth and smoke from artillery far off to the south. The commander awoke not to silence but to the hurried voice of his sergeant, who informed him that higher officers were expected to arrive for an inspection, a rare event that always stirred equal parts irritation and unease. Inspections meant that dugouts had to be tidied, uniforms straightened, rifles oiled to a shine, and even the trench walls repaired where they sagged, as though war itself could be hidden beneath a thin veneer of order. The commander sighed, for he knew his men were exhausted from the night's labor of laying wire, but he also knew that appearances mattered, not because mud-free boots could change the outcome of battles, but because the chain of command demanded proof of discipline, however hollow it seemed against the chaos of the front. The men, grumbling under their breath, set to work nonetheless, sweeping duckboards with brooms made of twigs, stacking empty ration tins neatly, even driving fresh stakes into the sandbag walls. Some joked darkly about whether the generals would also wish for the rats to be lined up in ranks, tails brushed and ears cleaned, and the commander allowed a faint smile at their muttering, though he did not let it linger too long, lest they mistake amusement for indulgence. He himself adjusted his tunic, brushed the dried mud from his boots as best he could, and prepared to receive whatever lecture the day might bring. When the staff car finally arrived at a rear dugout, its polished brass fittings strangely out of place amid the filth, two officers stepped out, one with a notebook already in hand, the other with an expression that suggested boredom rather than scrutiny. They toured the line with practiced detachment, asking routine questions, glancing briefly at the men, noting down trivial observations about drainage and rations, and all the while the commander answered politely, neither exaggerating nor complaining, presenting the reality without revealing the desperation that always lurked beneath the surface. He noticed how the soldiers stiffened as the officers passed, how they stood a little straighter, how their jokes fell silent, and he realized once again how fragile morale could be, how even the presence of outsiders shifted the delicate balance of life in the trench. After the inspection, when the officers departed in their car, leaving behind the faint smell of petrol and a trail of tire marks in the mud, the commander gathered his men and quietly thanked them for their efforts. He knew that gratitude was rarely expressed in such places, yet he also knew how much it mattered, and the men, though weary, responded with a little more energy, as though the simple acknowledgement restored something the inspection had taken away. With the formalities over, the day returned to its strange normalcy. Rumors began to circulate. Rumors always did in the trenches, about an upcoming push, about reinforcements arriving from distant regiments, about the enemy preparing a new offensive. No one knew where the whispers began, perhaps from a half-heard order, perhaps from a wounded man brought back from another sector, but they spread quickly, carried from dugout to dugout, until even the commander himself could not avoid hearing them. He listened but did not comment, for he understood that rumors, however baseless, were a way for men to make sense of the uncertainty, to give shape to the dread that otherwise remained formless. In the quieter hours of the afternoon, when no bombardment shook the ground and no runners came sprinting with fresh instructions, the commander walked the trench and observed how men found ways to pass their idle time. Some played cards with creased and mud-stained decks, slapping them down on overturned ammunition crates. Others carved small figures from wood, crude but intricate, gifts to send home if the chance arose. A group of men gathered around a harmonica, the faint notes rising above the trench like a fragile defiance of the war itself, while one soldier, more daring than the rest, attempted to balance a tin on his nose, drawing laughter that echoed briefly before dissolving into the damp air. The commander allowed these diversions, for he knew that a man who could laugh was a man who could endure. He even paused beside a soldier sketching in a battered notebook, the pencil moving quickly over the page to capture the jagged skyline of ruined trees and wire. The drawing was haunting, yet strangely beautiful, and the commander asked softly if he might keep a copy someday, to which the soldier nodded, surprised that his work had been noticed at all. As evening drew near, the commander received another packet of letters, some for him, some to be distributed among the men. He opened his own with deliberate calm, though inside his chest he felt the sudden quickening of hope. It was from his sister, written in neat handwriting, filled not with news of the war but with the ordinary rhythms of life back home. The harvest completed, the church bells ringing each Sunday, the neighbor's cow that had wandered into their garden again. The details seemed almost absurd compared to the mud around him, yet they were precisely what he craved, proof that beyond the smoke and wire, the world still carried on. He folded the letter carefully, tucking it into the inner pocket of his tunic, as though the fabric itself could guard it against harm. Night settled slowly, the sky a deep gray rather than black, for the flares fired intermittently by both sides cast eerie glows across the landscape. The commander made his final round, speaking softly to each sentry, adjusting the angle of a rifle here, checking the readiness of a signal flare there, and at last retreating once more to his dugout. There he sat at his desk, journal open, recording not only the day's official events, the inspection, the routine orders, but also the smaller truths, the laughter over the harmonica, the sketch of the ruined trees, the way jam had been shared only a day before. He wrote slowly, knowing that each word anchored him against the tide of war, and when at last he set down the pencil, he leaned back, eyes closed, listening to the muffled sounds of men breathing in their dugouts, and wondered silently how many of them would still be breathing when another inspection came. The night that followed began with an uneasy stillness, the kind that set every man's nerves on edge, for silence in the trenches was never truly a gift but a warning, like the pause in breath before a storm. The commander, seated at his desk with a dim candle guttering against the draft, felt it too, the heavy weight of anticipation pressing against his ribs, though he kept his face calm when he rose to make his rounds. The men, whispering in low voices, glanced upward often, as though the starless sky might give some clue as to what awaited them. It began suddenly, with the long, shuddering roar of artillery that seemed to split the very ground beneath their boots. The walls of the trench trembled, dirt cascaded from above, and the air filled with the acrid bite of cordite as shells slammed into the earth beyond the parapet, some so close that the concussion sent men sprawling. Lanterns fell, spilling wax across the duckboards, rifles rattled against the walls, and the shouts of men struggling to be heard over the bombardment merged with the deafening roar until it seemed that language itself was swallowed by noise. The commander moved quickly, not with panic but with urgency, his voice rising above the chaos in sharp commands that cut through the confusion. He ordered sentries to their posts, signalers to prepare flares, stretcher-bearers to stand ready, and he forced his way along the trench, steadying men with a hand on the shoulder, a firm word, a glance that carried more weight than a shouted order. One soldier, pale and trembling, dropped his rifle as a shell burst close, and the commander, without rebuke, bent to place it back in his hands, gripping his wrist until the boy's shaking subsided enough for him to hold it steady. The bombardment seemed endless, minutes stretching into an eternity measured not by clocks but by the rhythm of impacts, the whistle of shells overhead, the sharp crack of explosions near and far. Each blast threatened to cave in a section of trench, and the commander found himself shoving men toward safer corners, pulling others from half-collapsed dugouts, shouting hoarse instructions as dirt rained into his own hair and uniform. His lungs burned with dust, yet he refused to retreat, for he knew that his presence was the thin thread keeping fear from breaking loose entirely. At last, after what felt like hours but was perhaps less than one, the barrage began to fade, the intervals between explosions lengthening, the silence seeping back in like a tide returning to shore. In its wake, the trench lay scarred and battered. Sandbags torn, parapets sagging, duckboards upended, and men crouched in silence, eyes wide and ears ringing. The commander took a slow breath, tasting grit on his tongue, and began the grim task of assessing the damage. There were wounded, of course, there always were. One man sat clutching his leg, blood seeping between his fingers, while another lay groaning under a collapsed beam until stretcher-bearers carefully lifted him free. The commander knelt beside each in turn, offering words that were neither grand nor hollow but steady, practical, promises that they would be carried back, that the medics were already preparing, that they would see the dawn. He knew not all of them would, yet he also knew that hope, however fragile, could keep a man alive long enough to reach safety. As the wounded were carried away and the trench slowly steadied, the commander gathered the sergeants and outlined repairs to be made before sunrise. Even in the aftermath of destruction, there was work to be done. Shoring up walls, replacing sandbags, clearing blocked firing steps, and ensuring rifles were checked, for no one could be certain whether the bombardment was a prelude to an infantry attack. The men, exhausted and shaken, obeyed not because they wished to, but because they trusted the calm certainty of the man giving the orders. Hours passed in weary labor, the glow of lanterns casting long shadows across the mud as men rebuilt what had been torn apart. The commander worked beside them, lifting sandbags, hauling planks, not to prove himself equal, but to show that his role did not absolve him of the same filth and toil. By the time the eastern sky grew pale, the trench looked battered but serviceable, a scarred line ready once more to endure whatever came. When at last he allowed himself to return to his dugout, his uniform stiff with dried mud, his throat raw from shouting, he sank onto the wooden stool and pulled open his journal. His hand shook as he wrote, not from fear but from fatigue, yet he forced himself to record the night, every detail of the barrage, every name of the wounded, every act of quiet courage he had witnessed. He wrote of a soldier who shielded his comrade with his own body, of another who dragged a stretcher through collapsing earth, of the boy who had dropped his rifle and then steadied it again, firing into the night with trembling determination. These details mattered, he told himself, for without them the war would be reduced to numbers, and numbers alone could never capture the weight of what men endured. When he set down the pencil at last, he closed his eyes and leaned back, listening to the faint stirrings of men preparing for another day. The bombardment had left them shaken, but not broken, and as long as he remained steady, as long as he carried the silence and the certainty, they would endure, step by step, through the endless rhythm of war. The morning after the barrage unfolded with a strange calm, as though the earth itself had grown weary of violence and granted a brief reprieve. The men emerged slowly from dugouts, eyes red from lack of sleep, uniforms crusted with dried mud, but their movements carried a determination that defied exhaustion. Fires were kindled in small, makeshift stoves built from scrap metal, and soon the faint aroma of charred bacon rinds and strong tea drifted along the trench, a scent that seemed almost luxurious after the choking dust of the night before. The commander walked the line, not with the sharp urgency of battle, but with the steady step of a man observing recovery. He paused beside a group of soldiers crouched around a tin kettle, their laughter subdued but genuine as they argued over who had stolen whose share of tea leaves, each claiming innocence with theatrical gestures. He allowed the banter to continue unchecked, for he knew such arguments, though trivial, were a salve against the memory of crumbling walls and shrieking shells. In another corner, a pair of men patched uniforms with needles threaded from scavenged wire, their fingers clumsy but persistent. One sewed a crude patch shaped like a heart onto his sleeve, prompting his comrade to mock him mercilessly until both burst into laughter that echoed faintly down the trench. The commander found himself smiling quietly at the sight, for he knew that even in war, symbols of affection and jest clung stubbornly to life. Later in the morning, as the sun finally broke through the clouds, soldiers began repairing equipment with whatever materials they could salvage. Helmets dented by falling debris were hammered back into shape against wooden beams. Rifle stocks were polished with scraps of cloth until they gleamed faintly, and boots were patched with layers of waxed cloth. One soldier swore loudly that his boots were cursed, for they split open no matter how often he mended them, and soon the men around him began debating trench superstitions. The luck of carrying a coin from home, the danger of lighting 3 cigarettes from a single match, the belief that whistling at night would invite a sniper's bullet. The commander listened without interruption, his face thoughtful, for he knew these beliefs, however fanciful, gave men a fragile sense of control in a world where so much lay beyond their power. At midday, the sound of a field kitchen cart approaching brought sudden energy to the trench. The smell of stew, thick with potatoes, onions, and scraps of meat, spread through the air, and men lined up eagerly with mess tins, some humming tunes, others trading jokes about how the cook surely watered the pot with ditch water. The commander accepted his portion like the rest, seating himself on a wooden crate beside two privates. He ate in silence, listening as the men swapped stories about home. One describing the taste of fresh bread from his mother's oven, another recalling the sound of church bells on Sunday mornings, another laughing about how his younger brother had once stolen apples from the orchard and been chased for miles. The commander contributed little, but his presence, quiet and steady, seemed to bind the group, for the men spoke freely, as though his silence was a kind of encouragement. In the afternoon, with the trench steadied and the men settled, a new arrival drew attention. A young replacement, barely more than a boy, escorted by a corporal from the rear. His uniform was clean, his boots free of mud, his eyes wide with nervous anticipation. The commander greeted him with a nod, offering no speech but a simple instruction to fall in with his section. He watched quietly as the boy glanced around, bewildered by the mud, the patched walls, the weary faces, and the commander thought of the cruel truth, that the boy's uniform would soon be as stained and tattered as theirs, his innocence stripped away by the relentless rhythm of trench life. Still, he offered a few words of reassurance, telling him that the men would teach him quickly, and that in time he would learn how to endure. As dusk approached, the trench settled into a quiet hum of activity. Sentries took their posts, letters were written by candlelight, and the low murmur of conversation drifted through the dugouts. The commander withdrew to his small corner, where he unfolded the letter from his sister once more, reading it slowly, savoring each word as though it were food. Outside, the harmonica sounded again, the same plaintive tune as before, its notes rising into the dimming sky, fragile yet defiant. He opened his journal and wrote carefully about the day, the repairs, the laughter, the stew, the new arrival. He wrote about the way men clung to superstitions, about the small kindnesses shared over tea and stew, about the quiet resilience that allowed them to continue. He ended his entry with a single thought: perhaps survival is not only in strength, but in the stubborn insistence to find fragments of ordinary life amid the ruin. When the lantern was extinguished and the trench lay in darkness, the commander lay awake a while longer, listening to the faint harmonica, wondering what stories tomorrow would bring, and whether they would be told in laughter or in silence. By the time late spring arrived, the war along our section of the line had entered a curious phase, neither wholly quiet nor entirely violent, a kind of uneasy rhythm where the days seemed to stretch endlessly yet could at any moment be shattered by a single shell or an unexpected order. In such moments of deceptive calm, I often found myself reflecting not on strategy or upcoming battles but on the subtler, quieter aspects of life that kept men tethered to their humanity amidst the mud and the wire. One of those aspects was music, for though we had neither fine instruments nor trained performers, some of the men carried harmonicas, and one had salvaged an old violin with a missing string, and on evenings when the guns along the front fell silent for a few hours, they would gather by the dim light of a lantern and coax out melodies that drifted across the dugouts, fragile and haunting, sometimes cheerful but often filled with a melancholy that seemed to mirror the weight pressing on all our hearts. I remember one particular night when Sergeant Williams, who was usually all business and known for his sharp discipline, surprised us all by sitting quietly at the edge of the gathering, humming softly along with the violin as though the notes stirred something buried deep within him. Afterwards he admitted he had once played in a church band back home and had not touched music since the war began, for he felt it almost disloyal to indulge in beauty when surrounded by destruction. Yet that evening he seemed almost grateful, as though reminded that the world beyond the trenches still existed in some form. That night also sparked conversations among the men about their towns, their families, and the dances they once attended. Private Turner described the brass bands of his village festivals with such vividness that for a brief hour we were transported far away from the dugout walls, our minds wandering through fields and down cobbled streets untouched by war. The next morning, however, Reality returned with brutal clarity as reports came in that a neighboring unit had suffered heavy shelling, leaving their trenches collapsed and many casualties unaccounted for. I was ordered to send a working party to assist in clearing the debris and retrieving the wounded, and so I marched with a dozen men across the shell-pocked ground to where the devastation still smoldered. It was there that I witnessed a scene that would remain etched in my memory. Two soldiers, covered in dust and blood, yet alive, emerging from a pocket of collapsed earth where they had been trapped for nearly 12 hours. Their first words not of pain or fear, but a hoarse plea for water. We gave them what we had, carried them back on stretchers, and though they were scarcely able to walk, the look of gratitude in their eyes seemed more profound than any medal could bestow. As the weeks moved on, the weather grew warmer, and with it came new challenges. The stench of uncollected refuse and the swarms of flies became constant companions, adding yet another layer of discomfort to our existence. To combat this, the men devised small rituals. Trenches were swept as best they could. Makeshift cooking pits were dug further away from sleeping quarters, and any spare cloth was hung to dry in the sunlight, giving at least the illusion of cleanliness. It was remarkable how fiercely they clung to such small acts of order, for though the war reduced much to chaos, the men seemed determined to hold on to some sense of normal rhythm, as though sweeping mud with a broom could somehow sweep away despair itself. Amidst these routines, we received new recruits fresh from training depots, their uniforms still stiff and their faces unlined by fatigue. They looked upon us, the older hands, with a mixture of admiration and dread, uncertain of what awaited them. I tried to guide them gently, reminding them that bravery was not the absence of fear but the ability to continue despite it, and that listening to the advice of veterans would save their lives far more often than reckless heroics. One lad, scarcely older than 18, carried with him a small notebook in which he scribbled poems during any lull in the day. He shared one with me once, a few lines about dawn breaking over a meadow, and though the verse was simple, it struck me with its sincerity, reminding me again that behind each soldier's uniform lay an individual world of memories, talents, and quiet hopes. In such ways, the days stretched on, weaving together moments of music, disaster, recovery, and fragile beauty. And as I walked the trenches each evening, lantern in hand, I began to realize that my role as commander was not only to give orders, but also to safeguard those small sparks of humanity that kept the men from being consumed entirely by the grinding machinery of war. Summer arrived with its long days and heavy heat, and though one might imagine warmth to be a welcome relief after the biting cold of winter, it brought with it an entirely new set of difficulties, for the trenches became ovens under the glaring sun. The stench of stagnant water grew unbearable, and the men, stripped down to their shirts whenever possible, sweated and cursed as they tried to carry on their duties beneath a sky that seemed endless and pitiless. In these months, fatigue became almost a physical presence, pressing down on us as surely as the weight of the enemy's artillery, and even the strongest men found themselves moving slower, their tempers shorter, their thoughts often wandering to the cool rivers and shaded groves of home. Yet, oddly enough, summer also introduced small comforts that the men clung to with surprising eagerness. With the fields around us now green and alive, we could sometimes supplement rations with wild berries or herbs, and occasionally a farmer from a nearby village would sneak through with a basket of eggs or a jug of milk, eager to trade for tobacco or canned goods. I recall one morning when Corporal Harris, whose reputation was more for gruffness than charm, returned proudly with a small loaf of bread baked by a local woman, which he shared out in thin slices among his section, each man savoring it as though it were a feast. It was in such moments that I was reminded how little it took to lift spirits, how something as simple as the taste of fresh bread could make a man smile despite the thunder of distant guns. But the war was never far, and even in the bright days of July we were reminded of its shadow. The High Command ordered a series of raids to test the enemy's defenses, and one of these fell to my company. We prepared for days, studying maps by candlelight, whispering plans in dugouts, and rehearsing in silence. each man aware of the risks, yet carrying himself with that strange blend of resignation and determination that only soldiers possess. When the night came, moonless and heavy with mist, we climbed quietly from our trenches and crawled across the churned earth, our bayonets fixed, our hearts pounding in unison with the distant rumble of artillery. What I remember most from that raid was not the clash itself but the silence beforehand. The sound of breathing, the scrape of boots on dirt, the sudden awareness that every man beside me was balancing on the edge between life and death. When the signal flare lit the sky and we charged forward, time seemed to fracture into fragments of noise and motion. The crack of rifles, the cries of men, the rush of bodies through wire. We accomplished our task, capturing a section of trench and taking prisoners, yet the cost was immediate. 2 of our own did not return, and others were carried back with wounds that would scar them for life. As commander, I recorded the names, sent the reports, and offered words of praise. But in the quiet of my dugout, I could not escape the thought that I had ordered men into danger, and some had not come back. In the days that followed, the men spoke less, moving about their duties with a subdued air, as though each was grappling with private ghosts. To counter this, I tried to restore rhythm to our lives. Drills, cleaning, small competitions of strength or speed, anything to occupy their minds. One evening, I organized a game of improvised cricket using a plank of wood and a battered tin as the ball, and though the play was clumsy and the rules bent to nonsense, laughter returned to the trenches, echoing against the earthen walls like a bomb. It was then I realized that survival was not only about food, water, or bullets. It was about laughter, about music, about bread and berries and games of cricket. For without those things the men's spirits would rot even faster than their boots. As the summer dragged on, the heat gave way to sudden thunderstorms, and I will never forget standing on the fire step during one such storm, watching as lightning flashed across the battlefield, illuminating the twisted wire and craters in stark brilliance, while the rain came down in torrents, washing the mud from our trenches and for a brief hour making everything smell almost clean. It was in that moment that Private Thompson, drenched and grinning, shouted above the thunder, "Sir, even God seems to be shelling us tonight." The men laughed, and I laughed with them, and though the storm soon passed and the mud returned, that shared moment of humor carried us forward into yet another day of endurance. As the summer ripened and the weeks dragged toward autumn, I began to notice changes in the men that went deeper than fatigue or hunger. It was as if the war had begun to etch itself not only into their bodies but into their very thoughts, shaping how they spoke, how they dreamed, how they looked at the world. At night, when the guns fell quiet, I often heard restless muttering from the dugouts, men calling out the names of loved ones or waking suddenly in a sweat, convinced they were still under fire. Some confessed to me, in hushed tones, that they no longer dreamed of home at all but only of mud and wire, as though the war had invaded even the most private corners of their minds. I felt the same changes within myself, though I tried not to admit it. There were times when a sudden noise in the trench would make my heart leap, not because of danger, but because I could not tell whether it was real or imagined. Once, while writing a report in my dugout, I realized I had written the same sentence 3 times without noticing, my thoughts circling like a bird trapped in a cage. And yet, outwardly, I had to remain composed, for the men looked to me not only for orders but for steadiness, as though my calm might anchor their own. To combat the growing strain, I encouraged small routines that gave the illusion of normalcy. Some men carved figurines from bits of wood. Others wrote letters every evening whether they had news to share or not, and a few even held mock debates on subjects as trivial as whether tea was better taken strong or weak. I remember sitting in on one such argument, where Private Evans defended strong tea with the passion of a lawyer, declaring it the one drink sturdy enough to hold up the empire, while Private Moore insisted weak tea lasted longer and thus was the wiser choice in war. The men laughed, and though the debate was nonsense, I could see it provided a necessary outlet. a reminder that not every word spoken had to carry the weight of survival. One evening, as dusk settled over the battlefield, we received a visitor, a chaplain from division headquarters, who made his rounds offering prayers, letters, and sometimes simply a listening ear. He was a soft-spoken man with kind eyes, and though few of the soldiers attended his short services, many lingered afterwards to speak with him privately. What struck me most was how he listened without judgment. Men confessed fears they never admitted to me, speaking of guilt, doubt, or despair, and though I did not hear the words, I could see the relief on their faces after unburdening themselves. It reminded me that while I carried the burden of command, there were other forms of leadership, quiet, spiritual, unseen, that also sustained the men. But not all found comfort so easily. Some began to withdraw, speaking less, staring blankly at the horizon even when shells fell close by. One soldier, a veteran named Clark, had once been the liveliest storyteller of the company, regaling us with tales of his youth. But by late summer he had fallen silent, answering questions only with nods or shrugs. I tried to speak with him, to draw him out, but he only muttered that words seemed to have lost their meaning. It was in those moments I felt most helpless, for no amount of orders or discipline could mend what the war had taken from a man's spirit. The turning point for me came one night during a particularly heavy bombardment. We huddled in the dugouts as earth shook around us, the air thick with dust, the sound deafening. I noticed one of the younger recruits, barely 19, crouched with his hands over his ears, tears streaming down his face, whispering the same prayer over and over. Instinctively, I sat beside him, not as a commander but as another man, and placed a hand on his shoulder. I told him of my own fears, of the first night I had heard shells fall and how I had thought my chest would burst with terror. To my surprise, he looked at me with something like relief, as though knowing that even officers trembled made his own fear less shameful. From that night onward, I resolved to show the men more of my own humanity, for perhaps it was not strength alone they needed, but honesty. As the bombardment eased and silence fell once more, I climbed from the dugout and gazed at the scarred landscape under the pale moon. In that eerie quiet, I realized that the war was as much a battle for the mind as for the ground beneath our boots, and if I was to lead these men, I must guard not only their bodies but their very sense of being alive. When autumn came, it brought with it a chill that seeped into our bones, not the sharp bite of winter yet, but a damp, creeping cold that settled in the trenches like an unwelcome guest. The leaves in the distance turned shades of rust and gold, though we could scarcely admire them from our position, for the beauty of the season was always overshadowed by the work it demanded, repairing walls weakened by rain, bailing out water that gathered at the bottom of dugouts, and reinforcing duckboards so that men's boots would not sink into the sucking mud. The smell of wet earth was constant, heavy and sour, clinging to uniforms and skin alike, and each morning began with the same weary ritual of scraping boots clean, only to see them caked again before midday. Yet amidst the misery, there were strange, almost tender moments that reminded us of the world beyond the trenches. Villagers from nearby hamlets sometimes passed through, carrying baskets of apples, still crisp and sweet despite the frost, which they traded for tins of beef or cigarettes. I remember one old woman, her back bent with age, pressing an apple into my hand without asking for anything in return, muttering in a language I did not understand but with a look that conveyed all the pity and kindness words could not. I kept that apple in my pocket for 3 days before finally eating it, savoring every bite as though it were a memory of home itself. The men, too, found small ways to mark the season. Corporal Harris carved a rough whistle from a branch of oak, its sound shrill but cheerful, and would blow it each evening as if to announce that we had survived another day. Others collected fallen leaves and pinned them to their helmets, joking that they were now camouflaged as trees. Even in the thickest mud, even with shells occasionally breaking the horizon, they managed to find scraps of humor, and I often wondered if it was this stubborn insistence on laughter that kept them alive more than rations or rifles ever could. As commander, however, I had little time for laughter in those weeks, for orders arrived more frequently, demanding reconnaissance patrols into enemy territory. I accompanied one such patrol myself, moving silently through the dark with a handful of men, our boots squelching softly in the mire. We slipped past twisted wire and cratered ground, pausing often to listen, our hearts pounding each time a flare arced into the sky. From a shallow hollow, we observed the enemy lines, noting their placements, their movements, even the faint glow of their cooking fires. What struck me most was how alike they seemed to us. Men huddled for warmth, men repairing walls, men whispering in the dark. For all the hatred demanded of us, they were not monsters, only soldiers caught in the same grinding struggle. It was a thought I kept to myself, for it was dangerous to dwell on such truths when duty required resolve. Back in our trenches, life carried on with its peculiar rhythm. Rain fell often, drumming against the tin sheets that roofed some of our dugouts, while inside men lit stubby candles that guttered in the damp air. They told stories to pass the time, tales of farms, of sweethearts, of fishing trips and fairs. One evening, Private Evans described the harvest festivals of his village, with hayrides and lanterns and cider, and though the men laughed at his exaggerated tales, I noticed how they listened with rapt attention, each man imagining himself for a moment far from the mud, standing instead beneath autumn stars in a quiet field. But the war was never content to let us dream for long. A sudden order came down for a rotation, moving us to a sector further north where activity had increased. The march itself was grueling. Miles of tramping through mud that pulled at our boots, with packs heavy and rifles dragging at weary shoulders. Along the way, we passed convoys of artillery, great iron beasts dragged by horses that snorted and stumbled, their flanks slick with sweat. The sight reminded me that this was not merely a battle of men but of machines, of supplies, of endless movement behind the lines. A web so vast that any one of us was but a thread in its design. When at last we reached our new position, the trenches were worse than the ones we had left. Shallow, half-collapsed, and crawling with rats bold enough to scurry across a man's chest as he slept. The men groaned, but they set to work without complaint, digging, shoring up walls, laying boards, for by now they understood that survival lay not in what we were given but in what we made of it. As I stood watching them labor in the fading light of autumn, I felt both pride and sorrow. Pride at their endurance, sorrow at the knowledge that such endurance would be demanded of them again and again, with no clear end in sight. That night, as I wrote my report beneath the flicker of a candle, the sound of rain pattering above and the distant thud of guns on the horizon, I found myself wondering not for the first time what history would make of us. Would it remember the battles, the orders, the victories and defeats, or would it remember the apples, the carved whistles, the laughter in the mud? Perhaps both, perhaps neither. But for us, in that moment, it was those small, stubborn details of life that mattered most, and it was my duty to ensure that they continued, however fragile, against the storm of war. Winter came early that year, as if eager to test us with trials harsher than any shellfire. Frost crept into the trenches first in the nights, turning puddles to thin panes of ice that cracked beneath our boots. Then in the mornings, when the ground stiffened and men woke with their blankets stiff from frozen breath. Soon enough the snow arrived, soft at first, almost beautiful as it drifted across the battlefield, settling on wire and shattered trees, but quickly it became a burden, soaking through coats, numbing fingers, and making every step across the duckboards a slippery hazard. The men wrapped scarves about their faces until only their eyes were visible, and even then the cold bit at them until their cheeks turned raw. What struck me most about that first winter on the new line was the silence that fell after snow. Artillery still barked, rifles still cracked, But in between, when the world quieted, it seemed almost sacred, as though the war itself held its breath. Standing on the fire step one dawn, I gazed out across a landscape transformed. No longer a scarred brown wasteland, but a white desert, smooth and unbroken except for the jagged lines of wire. For a moment, it felt like standing on another planet, cold, distant, untouched by human life, and I wondered whether the war would ever end or whether it would simply freeze here, suspended forever. The practical challenges of winter were relentless. Boots froze stiff overnight, so men slept with them tucked under their blankets to soften the leather by body heat. Water in canteens turned to slush. Food, already scarce, grew harder to prepare as fires smoked and sputtered in the damp air. The quartermaster issued rum rations more frequently, not only to warm the men but to lift their spirits, and though I worried about overindulgence, I understood its necessity. A sip of rum before a sentry shift could mean the difference between endurance and collapse. And yet, amidst the hardship, there were moments of strange beauty. One night, during a lull, snowflakes drifted down in the light of a flare, spinning gently against the black sky, and for a fleeting instant the battlefield looked less like a place of death and more like a stage set for some forgotten festival. Private Turner, shivering beside me, whispered that it reminded him of Christmas markets at home, with stalls of gingerbread and lanterns strung across the square. He chuckled bitterly after saying it, but I could hear the longing in his voice, and it lingered with me long after the snow stopped falling. Christmas itself approached with little fanfare, though the men made what they could of it. Parcels from home brought tins of sweets, woolen socks, and in one case a tiny tree that Private Moore set proudly in the dugout, decorated with scraps of colored paper. That evening, we gathered around it, passing a candle from hand to hand for light, singing half-remembered carols in ragged unison. The voices were rough, some off-key, yet there was something deeply moving in the sound, a fragile echo of normal life in a world turned upside down. I looked at their faces in the glow, the weary lines, the hollow cheeks, the eyes still capable of warmth, and I thought that perhaps this was what kept us human, even here. Of course, the enemy did not pause for holidays. On Christmas morning, a shell landed not 50 yards from our line, throwing snow and earth into the air. No one was hurt, but the message was clear. Sentiment had no place in this war. Still, later that night, we heard faint voices from across no man's land, singing in another language, carrying on the still air. The men fell silent, listening, some smiling faintly, some frowning, uncertain of how to feel. It lasted only a few minutes before dying away, but it was enough to remind us, uncomfortably, that those who fought against us were also men who longed for warmth, for music, for home. As the days shortened and the cold deepened, sickness crept into the ranks. Frostbite took toes and fingers. Coughs became persistent. Fever claimed those too weak to resist. I wrote reports, requested more medical supplies, and visited the infirmary daily, yet it felt like fighting an invisible enemy. The doctors worked tirelessly, but their hands were tied by shortages, and more than once I watched them shake their heads over a man they could not save. In those moments, I felt the limits of command most acutely, for I could order charges, I could demand labor, but I could not command life itself to remain where it was slipping away. Still, the men endured. They joked, they cursed, they huddled for warmth in dugouts where candles sputtered and ice crept down the walls. And each morning, when the bugle called, they rose, stiff and aching, and did what was required. Watching them, I realized that survival in winter was not measured in victories but in persistence. Simply the act of rising again, day after day, against cold and fear and loss. And though the snow buried the battlefield in silence, beneath it beat the stubborn rhythm of life, refusing, somehow, to be extinguished.